All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we are going to be looking at large language models.
LLMs.
LLMs, exactly. And
The paper that we're looking at is large language models reflect the ideology of their creators.
yes, and basically you've given us this paper and you want to know,
Yeah.
do they have biases?
hmm
Are they shaped by the people and the places that made them? So let's dive in.
It is a fascinating question, you
Yeah.
know. I mean, we tend to think about AI as objective,
Right, right.
but this research, it really challenges that, like just that baseline assumption.
Right. I mean, think about it, like we are all using ChatGPT more and more these days. It's just incredible what it can do.
It's wild.
But if it's not actually neutral, what does that even mean for us?
That's what this research paper is trying to kind of unpack.
Mm.
The researchers, they argue that maybe even the idea of like a neutral LLM,
Yeah.
it might be a misconception.
Okay, so how did they test this? This is interesting.
So they did a massive study. They analyzed 17 different LLMs, which is actually a pretty big sample size for this field.
Oh, wow.
And they did it in English and Chinese, which is actually key
Okay.
because one of the big findings was that language impacts the LLM's output.
Wait, hold on. The language changes how the LLM responds?
Yes,
That's crazy.
it is. So for instance, they asked an LLM about this political figure who was known for being, anti-China,
Okay.
and it ranked him higher when they prompted it in English compared to in Chinese.
So you're saying depending on the language that you use, you're talking to like a different side of the same AI?
Yeah, kind of. It seems like the language activates different patterns and associations in the LLM, leading to different responses, which is just crazy to think about. I mean, it really highlights how complex these systems are.
Wow. That's like really making me rethink how I use these things.
Yeah.
So language plays a role. What else did the researchers look into?
They also compared LLMs created by Western companies versus ones developed in other parts of the world.
Oh.
And this is really where the idea of ingrained cultural perspectives comes in.
So you're saying like even if they're all processing information, their cultural background, so to speak,
Right.
still influences how they see things.
Yeah, yeah. The researchers found that LLMs that were developed in different parts of the world, they showed distinct patterns in their responses,
Oh,
even when they were prompted in the same language.
that's so interesting.
It's like they inherit some of the cultural assumptions and values of their creators.
Wow. So it's not just like the language, but it's almost like where they were raised, so to speak.
Yeah.
Fascinating. What happens if you compare Western LLMs to each other? Are there variations there too?
Yeah, absolutely. For example, the study found that Google's Gemini tended to rate individuals who were associated with liberal and progressive values
Yeah.
higher than other Western LLMs.
So even within like the same cultural sphere, we're seeing like subtle differences in how LLMs interpret and present information. What factors even contribute to these differences?
Well, the researchers, they don't really frame it as bias in like the traditional sense. They say it's more about the choices that are made during the LLM's development.
Choices like what?
Well, everything.
Hmm.
From the data sets used to train it to the algorithms themselves.
Okay.
Think about it like if you train an LLM primarily on text from a certain political leaning,
Right.
it might unconsciously adopt those views.
Okay, that makes sense. So are they saying that it's impossible to create a neutral LLM? So it sounds like we're talking about like a fundamental problem here. If even the people making these things are saying neutrality is a struggle, then where does that leave us?
Right. That's the big question. And it really gets to the heart of how we use these tools because they're becoming more and more powerful. And the
Yeah.
researchers are actually suggesting like a shift in perspective.
Yeah.
Instead of trying to chase after this perfect ideal of neutrality,
Right.
maybe we should focus on like transparency and diversity.
So instead of forcing LLMs to be neutral, we should be encouraging like a system where their inherent, perspectives are clear.
Right.
And that way we can choose, which LLM we use
Exactly.
and for what reason.
Yeah. Think of it like choosing a news source, right?
Okay.
We know that different outlets have their own slants,
Right, of course.
but as long as we understand that going in, we can still get value from them.
Right. That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
So how do we apply that to LLMs?
Well, we could have things like labeling systems that clearly identify an LLM's, general leanings.
Uh-huh.
It wouldn't have to be hyper-specific, but it would give the users a sense of its overall perspective based on its training data, things like that.
So almost like those like content warnings that you see on streaming services, but like for ideological leanings?
Yeah, yeah.
It's
Exactly.
interesting. It wouldn't solve everything,
Right.
but it would give us a heads up.
Definitely. It's all about empowering users to, navigate this new landscape with more awareness.
Right. This reminds me of something that you mentioned earlier, like agonistic pluralism. Where does that fit into this?
Yeah. Agonistic pluralism in this context basically means creating an environment where LLMs with diverse viewpoints can coexist
Okay.
and even, challenge each other. Imagine a search engine that doesn't just give you one answer,
Yeah.
but gives you multiple perspectives, each generated by an LLM with a different ideological background.
So instead of trying to create one perfect neutral LLM, we just embrace the fact that there are all these different complex systems
Hmm.
with diverse viewpoints. It's like a digital marketplace of ideas where users can compare and contrast different perspectives.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why transparency becomes crucial.
Hmm.
Because if we know where an LLM comes from, like the data it was trained on,
Yeah.
we can better understand the information it's giving us.
So knowing an LLM was trained on scientific journals might give me more confidence in its analysis of climate data as opposed to one that's trained on social media posts. Okay, I see. So we need transparency, diversity, and a healthy dose of skepticism when dealing with LLMs. What does this mean for, I guess, the future of these tools and how we regulate them?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Regulation is tough. But this research definitely highlights that we need to think about it carefully.
It sounds like a major change from like trying to control the content to focusing on transparency and diverse representation.
That's one way to look at it, yeah.
Yeah,
It might be less about telling an LLM what it can and can't say,
right.
and more about making sure that there's a system where different perspectives can, thrive.
It seems like the conversation is going beyond just like the technical parts of LLMs
Mhm.
and getting into like social and philosophical stuff too.
Absolutely. We're talking about how knowledge is created, how it's formed,
Yeah.
and how these tools might be shaping our understanding of the world.
Wow, that's a pretty profound thought. And that makes this research even more important, right? Understanding these inherent leanings of LLMs.
Okay.
If we're going to use them responsibly.
Exactly. It's not about dismissing them.
Yeah.
It's about using them well and knowing what they're good at and what they're not.
Okay, so we've talked about how LLMs are made, the potential for bias, but what about the users? How do we as people navigate this whole world? Do we all need to become like AI experts just to use these things?
That's a great question. It leads us to some more practical considerations
Mm.
for anybody using LLMs.
Okay.
And let's talk about that right now.
Okay, so we need to know how to use these things. So what can we do? Do we all need to become AI experts?
No, not at all. I mean,
Okay, good.
it wouldn't hurt,
Right.
but there are some really simple things that we can do to be smarter about how we use them.
Okay, so what are your top tips?
Okay, well, first of all, just be aware of where it's coming from.
Okay.
If you're using an LLM to do research,
Uh-huh.
think about who developed it.
Yeah.
What were their goals? What were they trying to do? It's just like if you were looking at a website
Right.
and want to know who runs it.
Yeah, totally.
Think about the background of the LLM.
So if I'm looking at something, kind of controversial,
Yeah,
it might be good to compare different LLMs, right?
exactly. Get multiple perspectives.
Okay.
That's going to help you see the bigger picture
Right.
and identify potential blind spots.
That makes sense. Any other tips for us non-experts?
Yeah, don't believe everything you read, right?
Yeah.
LLMs are powerful tools,
Right.
but they're not perfect.
Of course.
Think of what they give you as like a starting point,
Okay.
not the end of the story.
So use them to get ideas,
Yes,
generate possibilities,
brainstorm.
but always double check,
Mhm.
apply my own judgment and do my own research.
Exactly. They're like partners in the learning process.
Okay.
They don't replace your brain.
That's really good advice. This whole conversation has been so interesting. We've gone from, like, what are LLMs to how can they be biased, and now how do we use them well? Any final thoughts for our listeners before we go?
Well, I think the main thing to remember is awareness.
Yep.
These are powerful tools. They can change the world, but they're not neutral.
Right.
They reflect all the crazy, messy stuff in our world.
Yeah.
So, we need to approach them carefully, use our heads, and remember that they can be used for good or for bad.
That's a great point to end on. And like always, keep asking questions, keep learning, and dive deep.